There we go. So, hello everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for Letters from an Architect, the interior design and decoration of a turn of the century Seattle mansion with our featured guest today, Lawrence Larry Kreisman. Good morning, Larry. So, my name is Taylor Roden, and I'm the Community Events Manager here at Historic Seattle. Our mission is saving meaningful places to foster lively communities. Historic Seattle knows that our properties and our programs occupy the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. This acknowledgement is not a substitute for developing relationships with Indigenous communities or for honoring Indigenous stories as we share our collective history, but it's our first step in recognizing the people whose land we occupy. So before we dive into our program today with Larry, I do want to take care of a few housekeeping items, starting with thanking our sponsors for making Historic Seattle's virtual education programming possible. So thank you to our underwriting partners, bricklayers and allied craft workers, Local 1 and Washington, Alaska. Thank you to Daniels Real Estate, the Greystone, and the Lodge at St. Edward Park, and thank you to Selin Construction. And I also want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our co-presenters today. So thank you to the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation. And we are looking at the home of the trust in this photo. And thank you to the Seattle Architecture Foundation as well. So like I said, today we are joined, and thank you also to all of my coworkers at Historic Seattle. You all really make my job fun, and you make it possible for me to do all of what I do. So deep appreciation, and thank you, Naomi, for being here today. So today we're joined, like I said, by Lawrence Kreisman, Larry. So Larry was the program director of Historic Seattle for 20 years and the director of the Seattle Architecture Foundation Tour Program from 1990 to 2003. He's recognized for significant work in bringing public attention to design history, the Northwest architectural heritage, and its preservation through courses, tours, exhibitions, lectures like today's, articles, and 11 books. So what will happen today is we're going to switch our screen sharing. He'll do a presentation, and immediately following, we invite you all to ask Larry questions about today's presentation. You can use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, or you can put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout our time together today, and I'll just go in the order that I receive the questions. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Larry. I'll stop screen sharing so that you can get your presentation going here, and I will mute and hide my screen.
Okay, well, thank you for having me chat today with you. And I guess I have a long history with this house that begins in the early 80s. And I've watched with delight as this house has been preserved and stewarded through Patsy Bullitt Collins, the granddaughter of the C.D. Stimson family, and also Historic Seattle's protection of the building, and now the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation, carrying on that tradition of preserving an important house that means a lot to us in Seattle area, and is now the headquarters for the statewide preservation organization. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit, give you a little background, and then we're going to go in and walk through the house essentially. It's possible to examine the commercial and the residential buildings constructed by one American family, the Stimsons, over the course of a century in order to explain changing taste within American society, and particularly that of the development of the urban West. While the Stimson family was certainly a fortunate one in terms of its financial successes, and therefore was able to build edifices of some significance, the family's activities really reflect human nature more generally. The need to provide a legacy, to make a statement to the immediate world that he or she has been here, has done some things for the improvement of that world. The Stimson family represents 4 generations of builders, from the forests of Michigan in the 1840s to Chicago in the 1880s, Los Angeles in the 1890s, and Seattle well into the 1930s. And while family descendants continued to contribute substantially to the life of American Northwest, These later generations did not really qualify as builders, unlike those before them. The Stimsons reflect the common urge of American society to build comfortable homes filled with the latest conveniences. They also demonstrate the interest in real estate development and investment that stimulated the development of office buildings, hotels, theaters in major cities. Ultimately, the cities of the American West were settled and built by self-made men and women whose interest was motivated partly by financial gain, partly by recognition and acceptance of their peers, and partly by altruism and charity. The Stimson's architectural commissions in Los Angeles and in Seattle explain how Western cities shed their early day image of dirt streets and clapboard cottages, rowdy transient workers, oriented saloons and brothels, and slipped awkwardly, but with great anticipation and excitement, into the 20th century American experience. In the case of Charles Douglas Stimson, who I'll probably call CD from now on, his mansion, a rich correspondence from the well-known architect Kirtland in Spokane, along with inventories and documentation interior photographs, provide a rare, complete picture of the design industry and the designer-client relationship at the turn of the century. In the history of Western expansion, certain names appear in each generation in connection with certain industries. The strongly held familial obligations to hold on to and build upon the family business and pass that on to new generations is evidenced in all business, whether they may be a small dry goods store that becomes a major department store or a fledgling boat business that grows into a huge shipyard. The lumbering industry of the 19th and 20th century is a case in point. The evolution of lumber family dynasties coincides with the exploitation of resources from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast. Among these pioneer lumbermen, few stood higher in financial circles than the Stimson family. Thomas Douglas Stimson took advantage of the vast timber region surrounding the Great Lakes in Michigan and then invested in the dense Doug forests of Washington state that would be managed by his sons Ezra T. Stimson in Los Angeles and Charles Douglas and Frederick Stimson in Seattle. T.D. Stimson amassed his fortune in timber and milling, but by the time he left Chicago in 1891 for retirement in Los Angeles, he had dabbled in commercial real estate and looked at these investments as a hedge against the fluctuations of the lumber market. He'd invested in the Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan designed hotel and opera house project, the Auditorium, also in the Daniel Burnham designed Rookery and the Edward Bauman designed Chamber of Commerce. In Los Angeles, lured by the inexpensive price of property, Stimson erected a number of commercial buildings between 1891 and 1900. The most notable among them was the Stimson block at 3rd and Spring Street. At 6 stories high, it was the city's first skyscraper. He also erected the Douglas block at 3rd and Spring Street, the plans of which were completed just before his death in 1898. In addition, T.D. Stimson had architect H. Carroll Brown design a 30-room red sandstone mansion for himself and his wife Aksha that were a veritable castle, complete with a crenellated tower when completed in 1893. It was a mix of Romanesque revival, Jacobean, and Queen Anne Victorian, all rolled into one. Stimson had connections with the founder of the Pullman Company in Chicago, which built the Pullman cars for transcontinental rail. He had rooms in this house paneled and carved with myriad exotic hardwood from that company. T.T.'s son, C.D., who was with his brother Frederick in charge of the Seattle-based mill, followed closely in his father's footsteps. While ownership of huge tracts of timber, the company was able to create a thriving business headquartered in Ballard, which was a separate town at the time northwest of the city, annexed to Seattle in 1904. At one time, it was considered the largest producer of wood shingles in the country. Stimson diversified his holdings to eventually include a large amount of downtown Seattle real estate, just like his dad. Among his signature projects were the Plaza Hotel, the Crystal Pool, a saltwater indoor pavilion, and the Coliseum Theater, both designed by architect B. Marcus Pertica. He also played a key role in the development of the Metropolitan Center, including support for a community hotel named the Olympic after Stimson's own yacht, and the medical dental building named for him, the Stimson Block. He encouraged a Fifth Avenue entertainment district similar to the Broadway district in Los Angeles, where he had developed the $1 Million Theater in 1917. This led directly to his idea for the construction of the Skinner Building and the Fifth Avenue Theater. His last major project was the 1411 Fourth Avenue building. The C.D. Stimson Company, headed by his son Thomas, envisioned a smaller metropolitan center in Bellingham, and the Bellingham Hotel and the Mount Baker Theater are the only completed buildings in that vision. While all of these projects deserve discussion, I'm going to focus on Stimson's impressive private house on First Hill, which became the city's district of first families. It was a significant departure in both size and style from the typical mansions of the well-to-do in Seattle at the turn of the century. Early day Seattle comprised 7 hills that rose above Elliott Bay. In 1898, Seattle's First Hill neighborhood was named not for the large concentration of first families that would eventually occupy it, but for its location. During the preceding decade, the hill, located a steep climb east of the bustling waterfront and the varied commercial and private homes of the city, had been completely leveled of its native fir. This, if anything, probably had a positive effect on the First Hill's crest, becoming an exclusive residential enclave. The 1889 fire destroyed most of the wooden commercial district of Seattle, and new fireproof brick and stone commercial buildings expanded into the formerly residential areas. Church leaders also took the opportunity to move away from the center of that commercial and entertainment district to the relative safety and quiet respectability of the upper avenues and to First Hill, as did owners of residential property that would prove much more lucrative when developed for office and retail. The Stimsons and their son Thomas had lived north of downtown at the base of Queen Anne Hill since 1888. While not a modest house, it probably seemed crowded with the birth of daughter Dorothy Francis in 1892. More importantly, by 1898, Stimson had done quite well in his timber mill business. He'd been helped by the fire of 1889, the 1897 Yukon Gold Rush, the influx of many new families to the area, and the resulting sale of home sales throughout the city. The substantial residence of Seattle's first families would not have escaped his eye, nor would he have wanted anything less than he could afford for his wife and children. He saw First Hill as a suitable site for the new family home. Through business and social connections in Spokane, which thrived largely because of gold and silver mining interests in nearby Idaho, Stimson may have been seen and admired the Tudor Revival home of Amasa Campbell, completed there in 1898. He may also have inquired about the architect and met with Kirtland, whom he hired to design a residence in Seattle. Nor were the similarities of design lost on the Campbell family, who were not at all pleased when they discovered how closely Stimson's finished house resembled theirs. Kirtland-Cutter's firm grew up to be one of the most prolific in the state, with a client list that read like a who's who of industry and commerce. Born in Cleveland in 1860, he attended the Brooks Military Academy, studied at the Art Students League of New York, and proceeded to Europe for further study and travel. Arriving in Spokane Falls in 1885, he worked at his uncle's bank. Although he's reputed to have done some architectural work before this time, it was the Spokane fire of 1889 that really inspired him to form a partnership with John Potes, and which generated a great deal of commercial and residential work for the firm. When Potes retired, Carl Gunnar Malmgren became Cutter's partner, and together, until 1917, they were a highly successful team. Cutter was an eccentric. He was reputed to have a collection of wigs that he changed periodically to give the impression that his hair was growing or newly cut. Such concern for minute details was an essential part of his art. It also explained his drive to control every aspect of a project: exterior and interior architecture, design, and decoration. For some time, he carried on an interior design and decoration studio partnership to do just that. He was a master of the eclectic. His genius lay in an ability to combine the rich ornamental vocabularies of various classical, romantic, Romanesque, Moorish, Gothic, and Renaissance styles into successful residential architecture that balanced grandeur and intimacy in scale to allow both the formal and the casual moments of his clients' lives. The publications in his office library indicate that Cutter was also influenced by the late 19th century English arts and crafts designers, most notably William Morris, Philip Webb, Mackay Hugh Baillie Scott, and Norman Shaw. His designs for restaurateur Louis Davenport's Pennington Hotel, the Orange Blossom Bar, and private apartments epitomizes his understanding of current design trends in Art Nouveau, German Secession, Glasgow, and American arts and crafts. According to his contemporaries, Cutter was what we might call today the ideas man. He was far more interested in design concepts than in the mechanics of design, and much of his success was credited to his partnerships of nearly 30 years with Carl Malmgren and the various skilled drafting staff who transformed his thumbnail sketches into workable designs, among them Carl Neuss, Edwin Wager, and Andrew Willitson. For C.D. Stimson, as he had for the Campbells of Spokane, Cutter chose an English half-timbered style. During the preceding decade, local Seattle architects had continued the popular practice of designing commodious stick-style and Queen Anne-style wood frame houses with ornate trim and generously scaled verandas, porches, and bay windows. In many cases, they were simply pattern book houses implanted locally by skilled carpenters and inexpensive sawn timber at their disposal. Cutter's English design, with hand-adzed timbers, sawn decorative barge boards, and mock rafter ends, while gaining considerable popularity elsewhere in the country by 1898, was just beginning to make its appearance on the West Coast. Seattle architects had barely introduced it into their work, and certainly not on the scale that Cutter generated in the Stimson house. During the 2 years of construction and interior decoration of the Stimson house, Cutter wrote frequent letters to Stimson and his wife Harriet. These, along with inventory lists and invoices from 1899 to 1901, show that the architect was responsible for the complete decoration of the interior, from wall colors, fabrics, and furniture, down to the most minute details of the finish work. The correspondence and the interior photographs taken in 1901 reveal much about the practice of interior decoration early in the century. In particular, the letters affirm the respectful relationship that evolved as Cutter educated his client to his vision of how the house should be furnished. Here's a sample letter, but what I'm going to read you is a letter to C.D. Stimson dated May 9th, 1899, in which the architect assured his client, quote, "This house we consider better in many respects than the Campbell house, without being so expensive, though we are not at all certain with the present interior detail work that it will not exceed your limit of cost." As it turned out, the interior decoration and furnishings most certainly did exceed the initial limits of cost, and at times also pushed the limits of the cordial relationship between Cutter and Mr. and Mrs. Stimson. The 10,000 square foot house had rooms of varied and specific character, spaces considered suitable for the daily activities of men and women at the turn of the century. Visitors entered the pointed arched doorway into the Romanesque styled entry hall. Colonnettes with carved capitals supported a Roman barrel vault decorated with hand-painted red and gold canvas. Stairs led into the main hall and the dining room. The furnishings included a chest, table, standing clock, armchair, footstool, coat rack, all in Flemish and Gothic-styled carved oak. The doorway into the reception room and the living room and the dining rooms were fitted with red and gold Gothic tapestry draperies and pocket doors. To the right of the entry in the library and what was called the library and the living room, it functioned as both. There was also a stage for evening musicals because Harriet was a musician who frequently entertained visiting concert artists. It bore the characteristic dark oak and Gothic carvings of an imaginary English manor house or a private gentleman's club. It was dominated by a huge Gothic hearth supported with hand-carved lions and magnificent copper and steel dragon andirons. The walls were covered in green and yellow fabric in the style of Gothic tracery. The furniture included a mahogany table, sofa, bench, armchairs, a wicker chair, an oak writing desk and chair, teakwood taboret, and 4 large down pillows. The velvet draperies repeated the Gothic quatrefoil motifs found in the woodwork and the window moldings throughout the house. Cutter spent considerable time detailing the Gothic arched bookcases down to the Gothic brass hinges and hardware. By contrast, to the left of the entry was a light-colored, delicately plastered neoclassical parlor in the style of Emperor Napoleon's court designers Percier and Fontaine, with a French Empire-styled fireplace and mahogany gilt furniture where Mrs. Stimson could receive her friends and serve tea during the day when she was at home to callers. And in that circle, ladies would choose a specific afternoon to be at home that wouldn't conflict with any of the other ladies. Mrs. Stimson was at home on Thursdays to First Hill ladies. The walls were paneled in yellow Empire-style damask, and Cutter specified that embroidered green silk velour be used for furnishings. He also ordered 46 yards of Wilton carpet and border. In 1915, the Joshua Greens moved in, and this was the only room they really substantially changed, augmenting the ceiling plasterwork by removing the fabric panels and replacing them with neoclassical bas-reliefs and slightly different sconces and a larger mirror. Directly up a short flight of stairs was the stair hall, where 30 rolls of damask paper covered the walls. The staircase had handsome Gothic arched balusters and newel post with hand-wrought fixture. At the landing, the diamond-paned leaded window surrounds were surmounted by a cushioned window seat. The English Renaissance-styled dining room was paneled in honey-colored sycamore, and scenes of medieval court life were painted on corduroy above the wainscot. A dramatic blue glass tiled fireplace with a mantel carved in leaf and vine motifs and handsome brass sconces were the focal points of the room. Appropriately enough, the frieze above included a king and his court seated at a banquet table, about to enjoy a feast. The dining furniture included Flemish Gothic-style oak sideboard, serving table, china cabinet, and a dining table with 12 side chairs and 2 armchairs. Draperies were blue velour trimmed with tapestry borders. Cutter proposed a dark blue Indian rug of a size that would leave 2 feet of floor space uncovered all around. And don't we wish sometimes that these black and white photographs were also in color? The table was set with English and continental china and glassware. While the principal entertaining rooms were drawn from Western European decorative traditions, the Middle East did not go unnoticed. The most exotic room in the house was the den or gaming room, adjoining the billiard room in the basement. It had been inspired by the predilection for Moorish smoking rooms during the era when men could retreat after dinner to play cards, drink brandy, and discuss the latest business deals. Its brass filigree chandeliers, the gaming tables, oriental carpets, and the choice of saturated colors and patterns for fabrics and wall coverings captured the flavor of the Casbah. For this room, Cutter ordered Oriental-style silk window draperies and an ornately carved octagonal poker table, and a couch with a Middle Eastern geometric patterned canvas fabric. The adjoining billiard room was the only room in which America was acknowledged, taking the wallpapers from Native American motifs. The second floor originally housed 6 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. The rooms were light-filled and bright, with floral wallpapers and moldings painted white. Each had its own fireplace, distinguished by a different colored tile surround. And the bathrooms had the latest designs in marble sinks and white enamel pedestal tubs with chrome fixtures. Extremely generous closets and built-in drawers to accommodate the extensive wardrobes of the family were not initially designed, but were added by Cutter in 1904, along with a second bathroom, and would have been a welcome change from earlier houses where storage was low priority and huge armoires and chests of drawers were imperative. Cutter's correspondence reveals a cordial, polite relationship developing between the client and the architect, a prerequisite for someone interested in building his practice with the wealthy. He was always attentive, and his constant, sometimes daily correspondence kept the clients abreast of any new ideas he or his draftsman had for the changes. He also kept Stimson apprised of the cost for items or services and suggested alternatives where appropriate. He saw to it that every facet of the job was completed to the satisfaction of the Stimsons and apologized when, for one reason or another, there was inconvenience, delay, or change. 2 inventory lists were prepared. One was an estimate for furnishing the house, while the other arrived with the furnishings and was checked off as each piece of furniture, lighting fixture, drapery, or decorative accessory entered the doors of the new house. Some lighting fixtures and brass hardware, the locks and wallpapers were selected from catalogs, but others, along with furnishings, were manufactured to Cutter sketches and specs, or were ordered through W.L. Otis of Cleveland, Ohio, a firm with which Cutter did much business. He'd grown up in Cleveland and had many contacts there, having had a branch office in Cleveland from 1895 to 97. He also maintained that East Coast craftsmanship was superior. In his letter to Stimson dated December 16, 1899, he wrote, quote, "We are enclosing scale details of a combination gun case and sideboard for your den, on which we are getting an estimate from an Eastern manufacturer of furniture, as the work would be much more satisfactory if made in this way than by a local mill, as the mills have not the facilities for doing fine cabinet work." On December 18th of that year, he wrote, "We are just in receipt of bids from 3 first-class carvers on the large Gothic lions for your library fireplace, the lowest being $275. This seems a rather stiff price, but as the work is very difficult and can only be properly executed by an artist, we do not consider it unreasonable. There certainly are no wood carvers on this coast who can do justice to this class of work. The reason being there is not enough of it done to keep a high-priced sculptor constantly employed." On January 29th, 1900, claiming to have spent several weeks, quote, "looking up the best and most artistic things to be found in this country," end quote, Cutter prepared estimates for decorations, furnishings, and fixtures, and shipped the Stimsons a box containing sketches, photographs, and fabrics, quote, "showing designs, materials, and colorings, as in my judgment they should be used to produce the most satisfactory results. The scheme for treatment throughout is to me altogether the most satisfactory which I have planned," end quote. The architect eased his client's worry about costs by mentioning that, quote, "while the estimate runs higher perhaps than you expected, I know from both past and present experience that the same things which we have specified would cost you in New York or Chicago 25% more than our figures." So in justifying the expense of some of the furnishings, Cutter claimed, quote, "a number of pieces of furniture suggested for the hall and the library run somewhat higher in cost than the Campbell furniture. This is due to the fact that we have submitted pure, rich Gothic design on which there would be much more work and which would be strictly in keeping with the architecture of these rooms. I would strongly recommend the carrying out of work in accordance with plans submitted, as it being correct in detail would always be good, no matter how often styles might change. However, should you decide to cut down on the cost, less expensive things could be substituted, a partial list of which is attached to the estimate. Well, apparently most of Cutter's recommendations were accepted by Stimson's, and $16,000 changed bank accounts during the year that followed, a large sum in those days that's the equivalent of about $500,000 in current dollars. In the pursuing months, Cutter sought out and purchased oriental carpets, wallpaper, upholstery fabrics, sketched and sent to manufacturers drawings for electric fixtures, lanterns, wall sconces, ordered neoclassical plaster ornaments for the reception room ceiling, and selected Italian blue glass tiles for the dining room fireplace from what he said was a large number of the best examples of domestic and foreign makes, as being in harmony with the decoration of the room. The main floor was given over to warm finished oak and sycamore with fabric paneled wall coverings, and Cutter made a trip to Seattle in mid-May 1900 to assist in getting the colors for the interior oak woodwork and the exterior timber work, which are very important, he said, to the success of the work. Nevertheless, Cutter insisted that the soft woodwork of the bedrooms and the bathrooms, which we can consider were probably Doug fir, be finished in white or ivory paint. He said, as the natural color of fir is not in harmony with any chamber colorings, and the white is being used everywhere in preference to anything else. Not all of Cutter's proposals were carried out. He had sent drawings of an elaborate Gothic iron arch and lantern for the front entrance that on the 29th of January, he wrote, quote, "This work I think can be done from cheaper and in a more satisfactory way in the East." And for whatever reason, the piece was never made, perhaps because he also envisioned a brick wall around the perimeter of the house, and that also was not to be. Cutter also tried to interest Stimson in purchasing items not originally in the design, but which he was ordering for the houses of other clients. On April 7th, 1900, Carl Mamgren wrote, we have just completed a number of large red terracotta urns for the F. Lewis Clark House, which have turned out very satisfactorily. And as they would be in keeping with the architecture of your house, we thought it possible you might want to have, say, 4 of them made for your large veranda, as Mr. Cutter was told by the Denny Clay Company that they could not make red terracotta in Seattle on account of the color of the local clay. These urns are quite large and showy and would cost $10 in Spokane. Shortly after that, on June 16th, Cutter wrote, I have just succeeded in getting a very fine and rare suit of Italian armor, which is very beautifully etched. It would be very effective and most appropriate in your library. The price is $170. If you should happen to care for it, please let me know at once, as Mr. Clark is talking of buying it. Well, we know that 4 terracotta urns were ordered for the veranda, but the armor does not appear to be in any of the contemporary photographs of the library, so it was probably not on Stimson's list of priorities, or it was purchased by his other interested party. While Cutter did not directly purchase artwork for the house, apart from arranging for the dining room frieze, on May 11th, 1900, he wrote a letter of introduction for a Mr. William Morris, and that has no relation to the famous English designer, but it certainly was a popular name if you were in the design business. He said, Mr. Morris, who goes to your city with a small but very well-selected collection of paintings by some of the world's greatest artists. Mr. Morris is well known by lovers of art throughout the country and is recognized as being a buyer of unusual knowledge and taste. He has been very successful in Spokane and should certainly find a place for some of his gems in Seattle homes. I therefore have given him this letter to you, feeling more sure that you will be glad to assist him in meeting the right people. It's not known whether Stimson did indeed purchase from Morris or if any of Stimson's business associates and friends met and formed a buying relationship with him. However, the letter does demonstrate the way in which art was routinely purchased and distributed outside of established Eastern art markets, and that local taste in fine art was undoubtedly formulated based upon the availability of particular artists and stylistic treatments. Skilled craftsmen who had established working relationships with Cutter in Spokane were sent to Seattle to do the plasterwork, paper the walls, paint the interior, apply the canvas, and hand-painted fabric friezes that decorated the walls in various rooms. That summer, with nearly everything arriving by rail, the business of installing all the fixtures, furniture, and draperies began in earnest. Cutter continued to send notes and sketches to Stimson for approval regarding the detail of racks for the wine and cool room, seating in the billiard room, bedsteads, carpets. On July 6th, for example, Malmgren wrote, "Enclosed, please find blueprints of 3 different designs in fire sets, which we have selected for your dining room, these being numbered first, second, and third choice. We think it rather necessary to have quite ornamental sets for this room and the library, while in the other rooms they can be quite simple and inexpensive." The firm even specified the method of staining the woodwork in the den and billiard room on July 13th. Quote, "The specifications call for 1 coat of stain to be wiped for your den and billiard room, which would be sufficient for this climate, but in Seattle, where there's so much moisture, I should recommend brushing on a light coat of raw linseed oil to be rubbed off with cloths. This will be an additional protection to the wood and will cost very little." As with any project so large, some things did not go smoothly, and the physical distance between the architect and his client made it more difficult to clear up the various order mix-ups, late deliveries, and unacceptable work. Most disappointments and disagreements arose because of miscommunication with the suppliers, particularly the carpet manufacturers. Promised goods sometimes arrived much later than planned, or when they did arrive, had to be sent back because they were not the right ones. Cutter was held responsible for the delays, even though his letters tried to explain all of them fully to the clients. Because the letters don't exist between CD and Harriet Stimson and Cutter, there's no direct evidence of their response to these problems. While correspondence was his principal method of communication, Cutter occasionally used the telephone with some frustration. For example, on the 16th of October, Cutter wrote, "The telephone was working so badly this afternoon that I was unable to reply to your inquiries, which I could only partly understand. It was my hope to have everything about the house completed before your return from the East. But through the many bungling errors of the house, which is finishing the carpets, I have been unable to do so. After a great deal of correspondence and checking of figures, we have finally succeeded in convincing these people that they are to blame for the mistake in the reception room carpet, and a new one is being made. The stair and upper hall carpet should reach Seattle within a week, though we have as yet received no shipping bill. They either overlooked this part of the order or mislaid the data which we sent them, as only a short time ago, when we supposed the carpet was in the house, they wrote for more information. I assure you that I deeply regret the delay and the great inconvenience which it has caused you and Mrs. Stimson, and can only say that I have done and am doing everything in my power to hasten the completion of the work." As October dragged on, more things arrived, among them the lining and the hinge plates for the gun case and the large screen and the fire irons for the library fireplace. Because of an oversight, wall switches were not installed for the electric lights. On November 5th, Cutter wrote, "You state in your letter that the chandeliers can only be lighted by screwing in the bulbs. Are the chandeliers not provided with wall switches? It certainly would be very inconvenient to light chandeliers in the way you speak of, and as we never put them in without the switches, it has not occurred to me that they would be admitted. Please write me further in regard to this matter, stating which chandeliers you have to light in this way, and we will take steps to make correction at once." Well, as it happens, the chandeliers were turned on by switches built into them at the base, which Stimson may have overlooked and not known about initially. But the wall sconces were not, in fact, connected to wall switches. They had to be turned on by turning the bulbs or the shades. Additional furnishings were still being discussed and ordered as late as February of 1901. Last-minute changes also increased the costs, as this letter from November 20th makes plain. Enclosed, you will find a bill from the Western Mill Factory forwarded to us for collection. This is for the carving in wood in your dining room mantel and the egg and dart molding around the wainscot, which was originally specified to be plaster. I decided after the work was underway that the plaster work would not do in connection with hardwood, as we had an unsatisfactory experience with it here, and therefore I told the mill people to make carvings instead, at the same time telling them to get your consent to the extra cost for the same before going ahead with the work. This, it seems, they did not do, and they are now looking to us for settlement of the bill. The $24, the cost of the work above what the plaster relief would have been, we consider it reasonable, and the work in mantle particularly is quite elaborate and very well executed. $24, by the way, is about $750 in today's currency. During the period of decorating the Stimson house, Cutter had himself been planning an additional office in Seattle to broaden his base of commissions. For the Stimson project, he had subcontracted with the local architect Charles Webb to supervise the construction and interior furnishing, paying him 2% of every contract, and it was partly the cost of such an arrangement that led him to the decision to establish an office in Seattle. On July 6, 1900, he wrote to Stimson, "We are making arrangements to open offices in Seattle on September 1st, as we have found our association with Mr. Webb to be very unprofitable and realize the necessity of having our own force of men on the spot. We will say nothing to Mr. Webb in regard to our intentions until after finishing your work and dissolving partnership with him." In fact, it was March of 1901 before Cutter finally did open an office for a brief period. In the last extant letter to Stimson on the decorating of the house, dated February 9th, 1901, Cutter observed, "We expect to open an office in Seattle within the next 2 weeks, and the man who is going to take charge will go over in a few days to secure a location. After the 1st of March, I expect to spend a good deal of time in your city, as I realize that Seattle is the coming city of the Northwest. Until we send out our notices, for reasons which you will probably understand, we do not care to have anything said about the matter. We'll ask you not to mention it." Well, Cutter's work for Stimson was more than satisfactory, though through it and the connections he made during his work with the Stimsons, he was asked to design the Stimson Mill Company building in Ballard, and then in 1903, he was commissioned to design the prestigious Rainier Club, the most important business and social club in the Pacific Northwest. Undoubtedly, his connections here were valuable. Over the next decade, while carrying on his Spokane practice, he designed homes for some of the leading figures of Northwest commerce and industry, Judge Thomas Burke, Horace Henry, and Chester Thorne. While Stimson's First Hill home might have seemed a refuge from the business world, it in fact functioned as a social gathering place for business associates and as the focus of dinner parties and receptions for out-of-town guests. In the game room or in the billiard room, over after-dinner cigars, Stimson, Horace Henry, and his associates discussed their expectations for the city and their shared ideas for investing in Seattle's future. It was probably here that the idea for the Highlands development took shape, a magnificent bluff property above Puget Sound, north of the city. They commissioned the Olmsted brothers to develop the master plan of winding roads, taking in the views of Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountains. Kirtland Cutter designed the clubhouse for the Seattle Golf Club between 1908 and 9. By 1910, Seattle had announced to the world that it had come of age. The Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition of 1909 had focused national attention on Seattle and the Northwest as a gateway to the Orient and a rich area in which to invest. The population had increased to nearly 300,000, and areas of the city that had been cleared timberland in 1900 were by now thriving residential neighborhoods. First Hill was getting crowded. New homes, apartment buildings, hospitals were infringing on what had been a quiet and somewhat exclusive residential community 10 years before. The Highlands offered breathing space, privacy, and recreation within a short commute of the central business district. Lots in the development were determined by lottery. C.D. Stimson drew a site closer to the golf course, but he managed to trade his lot for Thomas Burke's prime location on the bluff. Kirtland Cutter was the obvious choice for a new and much larger house for C.D. Stimson, 20,000 square feet, that would include a ballroom on the lower level and expansive gardens designed by the Olmsted brothers. During 1913 and 14, as the English-style country house rose on its bluff, Harriet Stimson and Kirtland Cutter engaged in frequent correspondence regarding the disposition of everything from bathroom fixtures to moldings to wallpapers and carpets. It was an expansion of the First Hill process, and at least as it appears from Harriet's letters to her daughter Dorothy, then studying in New York, this time the house was designed to Harriet's specifications. The interiors were far more restrained than the work in the earlier house. On April 10, 1914, Cutter wrote, quote, "In studying our color scheme together with fabrics, I have striven to bring together in a simple and harmonious way, consistent with the quaint and unostentatious architectural treatment of your house, and to secure good and serviceable materials at bottom prices, and so that you would receive the benefits of the best discounts." We think that C.D. simply acquiesced and paid the bills as they arrived. It was, after all, his wish to please Harriet, and it is clear that the architect understood that in his dealings with the family. Go back to this. During his substantial career in Spokane and Seattle, despite his residential fees, which were substantial for such large estates, Cutter had difficulty holding on to money. Ultimately, his management of finances got the better of him, and his financial woes reached a point where at age 63, he had to quietly close up shop in Spokane. In 1923, he relocated to Long Beach, California to begin his career anew. With years of practice in working cordially and cooperatively with the most important figures in the Pacific Northwest, and his familiarity with the Olmsteds and the Highlands, it took little time to make the right connections with newly rich oil barons. He helped plan the exclusive development of Palos Verdes estates, designed award-winning mission-style stucco and tile homes for the wealthy, and a beautiful bathhouse facility fronting the ocean. His client list grew to include numerous residences in Long Beach and the Los Angeles area. In an interview with the Spokane Review shortly before he left Spokane, Cutter summed up his efforts of 30 years this way: "Never have I completed a commission without wishing I could do it all over again and do it much better. Some of my first homes here, like the Glover home or the F. Rockwood residence, have been treated very kindly by the vines which have covered their early faults. I always built to achieve the effects of age, at least to make the building fit into its surroundings, to look as if it had grown there and had not been superimposed. I've been criticized for that quality many times, but the wind and the weather, when they complete the work I start, the owners are usually reconciled to the idea." Charles Webb, Cutter's superintendent of construction, built a substantial list of clientele whose homes followed the style of the Stimson property. Not coincidentally, one of them was Frederick Stimson, Charles's brother, for whom Webb, in partnership with Louis Mendel, built a house on West Highland Drive. The design process began in 1901 and took nearly 6 years to complete. Unlike Cutter, who insisted on controlling nearly all the interior design and decoration, Webb suggested, and the Frederick Stimsons agreed, that the St. Paul firm of William French should completely furnish and decorate their house. The one exception and it is a remarkable one, is the ballroom that Webb designed, inspired by his knowledge of Louis Sullivan's floral and geometric design vocabulary for the auditorium building on which he had worked before settling into Seattle. One wonders if Webb realized that C.D. and Frederick's father, T.D., had been a key investor in that Seattle project, in the Chicago project, at the very time that Webb was in Sullivan's office. The significance of Kirtland Cutter's First Hill residence lies in its introduction of an English half-timbered style of domestic architecture into Washington state architectural circles at a scale that had not been seen or attempted before. He was an architect who was committed to the details of the interiors and the furnishings, as well as the architectural shell. His almost obsessive devotion to detail resulted in rooms that were historically derived stage sets for living and entertaining. His work set a precedent and offered a prototype that would be copied and embellished by a host of local designers in the first decade of the 20th century. These gracious traditional homes lined defined the streets of well-to-do Seattle neighborhoods of First Hill, Queen Anne, Capitol Hill, Denny Blaine, Washington Park, and University Park. Joshua and Laura Green, who purchased the house in 1915, undertook very few changes and lived there until their death 3 weeks apart in 1975. She at 101, he at 105. Historic Seattle Preservation and Development Authority purchased the house in 1975 and arranged for landmark status at the city, state, and national level in order to protect the exterior and major interior spaces. After several business owners used it for offices and entertaining, Priscilla Stimson Bullitt Collins, granddaughter of C.D. and Harriet Stimson, purchased the house in 1986 and invested significantly in upgrades. In 2001, she gifted the home to the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation, the statewide preservation organization, who are its current and future stewards. Patsy encouraged my research and discovery about the house and its broader reaches, that unearthed the extent to which her multi-generational family had involved itself in business, civic engagement, and cultural facilities in Chicago, California, Seattle, and Bellingham. The result of our work was the Stimson Legacy, Architecture in the Urban West, and if you had enjoyed this presentation, the publication will not disappoint you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Larry. And I did turn your video off as requested. So now we're going to do our Q&A. So if you want to turn your video back on, now would be the time. It looks like we have 5 questions. Awesome. So I'm just going to start in the order that I received them on my end. And folks, if you have more questions for Larry, please feel free to just put those in the Q&A. Alrighty, so our first question is, why did the Stimsons leave so that Green could move into this house in 1915? And it continues, perhaps Cutter's need to have several wings of different lengths was influenced by his name. And you can also, if you want, I can put these in our chat too so that you can see them.
Just repeat that. I was just getting myself on screen there. The question was about...
It's a 2-part question. It was, why did they leave so that Green could move into the house in 1915? So I'll let you answer that part first.
Well, Green did not buy the house from the Stimsons. Apparently it was bought by someone else who never moved in and lived there, but who then turned around and sold it to Joshua Green in they moved up to the Highlands in 1914 and sold the house. And they moved up to the Highlands because the house was ready for them to move into, the bigger house. So there was an interim owner, but only for a brief period. And then the Greens lived there from 1915 until their death.
And the part 2, now that I read it not as quickly as I did the first time, is funny. It continues, perhaps Cutter's need to have several wigs of different lengths was influenced by his name. I like that question.
Pass on that. I don't know. I thought of it, it's one of those mythic stories that is so colorful that you have to talk about it, but we don't really know, do we?
I appreciate that.
Somebody may know. His wife might know.
Our second question you somewhat answered, and this will be included in the follow-up, but it's, do you have books that you can recommend for those who are interested in learning more about architecture and the Stimson family? So I know that the answer to that is yes, but I'll let you answer.
Well, the answer is yes. The Stimson legacy is available in the public libraries, and Historic Seattle has a number of copies if you want to reach out to Historic Seattle. And Historic Seattle produced a book on the history of First Hill in 2014 that has a great deal more information about the context of how the hill developed, and the other families that lived in adjoining blocks where there were probably 40 mansions and large residences at one point, and there are now essentially the Stimson-Green Mansion, the Dearborn House, and the Hopius House, and the Stacy Mansion, which is the University Club. So of 40, there are 4. And I did show a photograph early on next to the photograph of the Stimson House. That was it said the T.T. Minor John Collins house, which used to be on Minor Avenue. And that's more typical of what was being built in the 1880s and early 90s. There are lots of books on Seattle history, and there are certainly some books about the Stimson descendants, like Dorothy Stimson Bullitt, her life story, by a woman named Haley, if you're interested in her stories of developing King Broadcasting, if you want to move into the 30s and 40s.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that question. The next question that we have is, what happened to the letters between the Stimsons and Cutter that no longer exist?
I have no idea what happened to the Stimson correspondence with Cutter. There are 93 linear feet of paper goods, materials, and ephemera at the University of Washington Special Collections that are from the Stimson Mill Company that were donated to the university. And in those, I found some fascinating material, including letters from the architect Louis Sullivan in 1891, written to T.D. Stimson, asking him if he could do some work for him in Los Angeles. So there are some treasures there. But as far as letters that the Stimsons might have written to Cutter, they would have been in Cutter's office. And even though the Museum of Arts and Culture library has some of Cutter's library and some of his drawings and a lot of the architectural drawings for a number of his projects, including the Stimson-Green Mansion, those have never turned up. And in fact, the letters that I quote from were in Patsy Collins' possession. And I could digress with a little story that I was doing tours of First Hill that brought me into the Stimson-Green Mansion to tour the house in the 1980s. And originally it had been, when I negotiated going into the house on a Saturday, it was with the previous owners. And then all of a sudden it had changed hands. And one morning, this short woman, not fancily dressed, opened the door and led me in. And I thought she was just there to help me get into the house. And I'm walking people around and talking about the house and its history and the family. And we're up on the second floor landing. And she says, so have you ever seen the letters that Kirtland Cutter wrote to my grandfather? And she did share all these original materials with me. And then she allowed me to go into Dorothy Bullitt's King Broadcasting office on Aurora Avenue and go through all of her archives, which pulled all these photographs out and family photographs. I do not know where all of that went. When Patsy died, I did a search and they're gone. Fortunately, I have Xerox copies, and I have the copies of the prints in negative and print. So I've saved that. But that's the thing about historic materials. People don't necessarily think about where they should go after the fact. They disappear.
Wow. What a story. And great question. Thank you for asking that. So our next question is, how was the Stimson Mansion heated? Were fireplaces the only source of heat?
No, it had It had a large furnace. I think it was originally coal. It was removed and replaced. They had hot water radiator heating, and the radiators are actually hidden in most of the rooms behind screens next to the windows. So they're almost like window seats. But it was very efficient. It was very up to date. Some of those pipes that supplied the hot water heating also heated the drying racks in the basement, so that when the linens were done, you had a mangle to squeeze out the water and basically iron them, and you'd hang them up on these drying racks, and they'd be dry and ready to use. And they are still in place in the Stimson-Green Mansion.
So 4 more questions. 2 from Dawn, 1 from Wendy, and 1 from Kate. The first question from Dawn, is the home in the Highlands ever open for public viewing?
No.
Okay.
It's private, and the only times I've been up there, I was doing a presentation, and they're private owners have parties, and they do have people come in, but only by invitation.
Our next question, how many floors are required to essentially classify a building as a skyscraper?
Depends what year you're talking about. If they can call the 1891 building a skyscraper at 6 stories, then and the Pioneer building in Pioneer Square would have been a skyscraper in its time too, because it would have been so much higher than the 1, 2, and 3-story buildings around it.
Okay. And then our next question, what is the story about the bear cubs, now sculptures in the adjacent mini park?
I didn't know there was a sculpture in the park. It must be a new addition. So if my memory is clear, there was an orphan bear cub from the mill company, from the I think they found it in Marysville in their property, an orphaned little cub, and CD brought it home, and it lived for a while at the Stimson Mansion, but it then got given to the zoo. I may be wrong in my story, but I think that's what it clicks in my head.
I like that story. And our final question today is it true that property deeds of homes in Ballard that are dated 1907 do not reflect the actual date the home was built, that many of these homes were built much earlier?
That is probably true, because when Ballard was annexed to the city of Seattle, and then these homes became part of that record, the people who were filling out those forms probably were guesstimating. Even homes in Seattle that, if you look at the King County archive records, the property records with the photographs, sometimes the date of construction is a guesstimate of 1900, 1905, 1910, because they're not sure.
Okay. That was our final question. So thank you very much for today's presentation. And I wanted to let you know that you are getting love and praise in the chat.
I like that.
Yes. Clap. The other comment says, wonderful presentation. Thank you. It's so nice to see and hear from you again. So, and I echo that sentiment. Thank you, Larry, for working with us and doing another program. Just so that everyone knows, I imagine that you all are subscribing to our newsletter, and you'll hear about our upcoming programs this coming week, but we have another program with Larry in April on the 28th, so you'll see information about that. It'll be live on our website, I think starting on Monday. And as for today's program, I will put the recording on our YouTube channel, and as soon as that is live, you'll get an email from me with that recording so you can watch it again or share it with friends. Any announcements from you before we sign off for today?
From me?
From you, yes. Because I know you're doing so many things, so if you'd like to tell folks.
Oh, it's still, for me, it's a great pleasure to share this information with people, and I am very much of the of the age that I really like to be in person with people and sharing connection with them in the chapel space or wherever we meet. And I hope that we get back to that at some point pretty soon. I know that in April it will not be, but hopefully by the fall we'll be able to do things like that together.
That would be wonderful. But
Oh,
yeah,
I did want to mention that there will be, Historic Seattle is working to create for History Link a First Hill self-guided tour that will be available on History Link probably by the summer. And it'll give you a chance to walk around First Hill without me leading you, and experience some of the buildings that are still part of that heritage that are sometimes hard to see when you drive through a place and all you see are hospitals and parking lots. But this is a way to stop at your leisure with your own time and absorb those wonderful buildings that are still there.
thank you for that plug. I'm very excited to take that tour when it is ready. All right, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday. You'll get that email from me that will include, again, the recording of this lecture, and it will also include links to purchase a couple of Larry's books in our online store. And if you have any other questions, feel free to just email me, and I'm happy to share your questions and comments with Larry directly. And I will see you in a month. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.